The Regency era is known for many things: a rich social culture, extreme class disparity, and of course being the setting for many steamy romance novels. If you've read any of the latter, or are familiar with the works of Jane Austen and breakout hits like Netflix's Bridgerton, you probably know this time period by images of the social season, where the wealthy elite would attend lavish parties and try to marry off their children. But what was the season actually like? Did rich people really spend all their time partying? And more importantly, how much did all of this cost? Ladies and gentlemen, this is Historadame, and today, we're learning all about the obscene wealth of the Regency Era Social season. So before we can get into all the partying and throwing money around, first we need to ask, what exactly was the social season? Also sometimes referred to as just the season, this was a time when all of the wealthy lords and their families would descend upon London for the sitting of Parliament. Here they would attend all kinds of social events, like balls, the opera, dinner parties, and of course going to court. Many of these social events were geared towards matchmaking, particularly those in the spring months, which was known as the marriage season. These exclusive parties and venues provided young people with a controlled environment in which they could socialize, knowing that it would be with the right kind of people. The season was also a time of public spectacle and performance. People used these events to gain status and connections. But this wasn't just done through their vast amounts of wealth. Being rich was of course a requirement, but every aspect of your character would also be analyzed with a fine-tooth comb by society at large. Any action during the season could make or break your reputation. You needed to make sure that you were wearing the right clothing, going to the most fashionable places, displaying perfect manners, and of course engaging with the right social circle. Naturally, the desire to show off and improve one's social status resulted in the season being a whirlwind of events at a breakneck speed. Members of the gentry wouldn't just be going to a couple of balls a week, they would be enjoying multiple entertainments every single day. In the morning, you could expect to be making social calls or going for a promenade around Mayfair, which allowed you to maintain connections, but also to see and be seen. Then in the afternoon, there were things like picnics, teas, and art shows, before you had to put on your formal clothes and head off to the theater, the pleasure gardens, or a ball. If you think that a few parties around the holidays are busy, you have no idea, because people in the Regency would be partying like the world was about to end. Remember, members of the gentry typically didn't work. As a result, their jobs ended up being partying and buying fancy things. And boy did they have a lot of ways to use that money. Going to the pleasure gardens was a necessary outing for any fashionable person's weekly schedule. For anyone who is unfamiliar with the concept of pleasure gardens, the closest modern-day equivalent would probably be an amusement park. These were large public spaces that a person could access by paying an admission fee, featuring well-manicured gardens and landscaping, with various trails that people could walk through. These trails were known as walks, and were separated into very neat and manicured garden paths, as well as wilderness portions. Throughout these trails, there might have been interesting things to see along the way, like fountains, man-made caves, waterfalls, sculptures, or lighting displays. Pleasure gardens also contained entertainment venues, like a central bandstand, pavilions that housed various shows, and areas for dancing and refreshments. Though there were many pleasure gardens around London during the Regency, the two most popular were Vauxhall and Ranelagh. Vauxhall cost around 1 shilling per visit, which is around £2.50 or $3 today. And this price got you access to various entertainments, like musical shows, acrobats, fireworks, and hot air balloons. Now, this might sound incredibly cheap, but the average annual income for a working-class family was only £30, so the admission fee still kept the riffraff out. Vauxhall was, however, affordable for most people of modest means, which meant that both the middle and upper classes were able to go relatively regularly. That being said, admission wasn't the only expense needed. Much like modern amusement parks, Vauxhall was known for outrageous food and drink prices, and it is likely that there was some class divide between those who could afford them and those who could not. Ranelagh, on the other hand, was Vauxhall's main competitor, and was considered to be the more exclusive of the two. Its admission fee was 2 shillings and 6 pence, over double that of Vauxhall, and because of this it was seen as a more fashionable option, catering heavily to a wealthier crowd. Ranelagh offered some of the same entertainment that its competitor did, but also included a grand rotunda as its centerpiece, featuring Rococo architecture. Pleasure gardens provided great opportunities for Regency-era nobility to socialize and have fun, and the fact that middle-class people were able to get access on occasion meant that you could flex on all the poor people while you did it. That being said, those with more means would be able to visit them more often than the average person. But that didn't make them the best place to go if you wanted to network, or especially find a husband. For that, you wanted a more exclusive event. Now, if you were looking to socialize or find yourself a partner, the best place to do that probably would have been at a party, usually a ball. A typical ball could be expected to begin somewhere around 8 p.m., and could last all the way until morning. The entertainments could include socializing, music, and plenty of dancing, usually with a break halfway through for dinner. A sit-down dinner at a ball was just as grand as the party itself, having multiple courses with around 60 dishes in total. If the festivities lasted particularly long into the morning, it could also end with a breakfast. If you want to learn more about what Regency-era dining was like, I've already done a video on that, which I'll link in the description. Now, there were two types of balls that you could attend during the season, public and private. A public ball would be open to anyone, and would have been held in a large space like a pub or assembly hall. Since these were also open to the lower classes, they could become very crowded and noisy, and were usually considered to be a fun party, but a more casual affair than most were looking for. Still, by attending you could show off to the poor people, and that was always an important part of the season. A private ball, however, was a more exclusive and formal event, to which you had to be directly invited. This meant that all of the guests were the cream of the crop, and it was an ideal location for a young lady to find herself a husband. Since a private ball was usually only for the rich, it had much nicer things to offer: better music, better food, and fancier decorations. During the height of the season, members of the gentry could be attending multiple of these private parties every week, with the exception of Wednesday nights. For those lucky enough to gain entry, Wednesday nights would be reserved for the weekly ball at Almack's assembly rooms. These parties were one of the main events of the season, and was known as the place to find yourself a husband, so much so that it actually earned the nickname the Marriage Mart. But not just anyone could walk into Almack's. This was a members-only kind of place, and in order to become a member you first had to apply. Each applicant would be reviewed directly by the lady patronesses of the club, who would determine if you were good enough to become a subscriber. This was not just based on your material wealth, but also on your family lineage, reputation, title, and connections. In case you haven't noticed, living as a member of the gentry during the Regency era was like doing constant career networking, except you had to do it all the time for the rest of your life. If your application to Almack's was approved, you would receive an entrance voucher, and were then able to pay the 10 guinea subscription fee, which would give you access to one ball and one supper every week for 12 weeks. Having a voucher to attend Almack's could greatly improve your social standing, and for young ladies, practically guaranteed them success in finding a match. But this voucher could also be taken away if one did not follow the rules, or found themselves entrenched in scandal. And just as much as a voucher could elevate your social status, losing it could be devastating. Aside from visiting the pleasure gardens and going to balls, there were plenty of other activities that kept members of the gentry occupied. Gentlemen's clubs were particularly popular. These were private establishments that were for men only, where they could drink, converse, and sometimes even gamble. Anyone who wanted to make business deals or find good connections for their career went to a gentleman's club. During the Regency, the three that were the most popular were Brooks, Boodle's, and White's. The latter of the three was the most fashionable and exclusive, which, like Almack's, you would have to apply to in order to gain membership. Once again, being accepted was not solely based on how rich you were, but rather your status and reputation. It was common for young men of high society to be put on the application list for White's upon being born, sometimes even before their birth was recorded at the registry office. Another fashionable activity during the season was attending races at Royal Ascot. Going to horse racing was one of those places where it was very important to be seen making an appearance, especially for women, who would commission specific outfits and elaborate hats just for the occasion. And speaking of places to be seen, none were better than the theatre or the opera. Box seats, of course, were required for any fashionable member of society. Wealthy families who attended the theatre might rent the same box for the entire season, sometimes even keeping it in the family for many years. Those who could not afford the fee for a box of their own might split the cost with another family and share. Now, were these the best seats to see the show? Absolutely not. But they were the best for everyone else to watch you. Most people weren't actually there for the performance. They were there to be seen and once again to make connections. Because of this, it was normal for people to arrive late to the show and talk through the entire performance. Sometimes the greatest signs of wealth were not the ability to go to all these fancy places, but rather for the cost to mean so little to you that you didn't even need to care about the thing that you paid for. There was no shortage of entertainment during the social season. When people weren't going to balls or the pleasure gardens, they would be going to picnics, luncheons, tea parties, art shows, and they would be doing more than one of these things every single day. Being rich and not working was a full-time job. And of course, all of these luxuries tended to add up. So how much did all of this cost? Well, members of the gentry could expect to pay a large sum of money already to go to all of these events. But there were also other costs that came with the season. You would need a lot more money if you had a large family, especially if that family included young women who were out in society. Just a quick disclaimer, I used an inflation calculator to get the prices for the next portion of this video, and these are not always 100% accurate. Think of these numbers as more of an estimate than an exact value. Not every family would have their own house in London, so in order to enjoy all that the season had to offer, they would either need to stay with relatives who did, or they would need to rent something. The bare minimum was a medium-sized house in a good part of the city, which could cost around £12 to £25 a year, plus another £25 for any coal that would be needed to heat the house during the winter months. If you're paying for something on the higher end of that scale, this comes out to around £2,300, or just over $4,000 in today's money. Then you would need to worry about food, which for 6 people could cost around £2 a week, provided that they weren't hosting any formal dinners, and you keep in mind that they would have been eating at other people's houses quite often. And of course, a rich family wasn't going to make all of this food themselves, or care for the house that they were renting, so they would need servants, which could end up being one of their biggest expenses. For the standard set of household staff, you would want a cook, at least 2 maids, a coachman, and a footman, which could cost another £87 a year. Another huge expense was transportation. Obviously, you wouldn't be walking to all of these fancy events. You would take a carriage. The average noble family might have 1 carriage, but the wealthiest of the bunch could have multiple, as well as several horses. The cost to keep a family-sized carriage in the city was a whopping £400, or £32,000 when adjusted for inflation. But above all else, the thing that likely cost families the most was supporting their eligible daughters through the marriage season. Being fashionable in high society meant that young ladies would need lots of different outfits. They weren't just wearing a single dress each day. They had an ensemble for the morning, for walking, riding, attending afternoon events, and of course all of their evening gowns, as well as dresses for wearing to court. And each one of these outfits would require undergarments and accessories that came with it. And let me tell you, this got expensive. A well-off family could sometimes spend around £500 just for one daughter's wardrobe, or almost £30,000 today. Those who were in the highest percentage of wealth could even spend up to £15,000, or over $872,000 when adjusted for inflation. So there you have it. That's a little glimpse into what the average season was like for the upper crust of society. They were basically bleeding money on a daily basis. It's no wonder that the season was such a big deal to them. Honestly, I think it sounds way too exhausting. Hey everyone, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or a comment down below. If you want to see more content like this, you can also subscribe to my channel, and keep up to date on all the fun history videos of the future. But for now, I bid you farewell.